Bandwidth for this podcast is brought to you by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
Welcome to MacBreak Studio. I'm your host, Brian Gary. I'm here with Mark Spencer.
Hey, Brian.
How you doing?
Great.
One of the things that is new to the whole Final Cut Studio, Final Cut Studio 3, Final Cut Studio 09,
Final Cut Studio,
Studio, is the interaction with the different applications in the suite with Compressor. You know, I've talked about before where no longer are you exporting to Compressor, you're sending to, or you can access it through the share menu. And that's for both Final Cut and Motion. Motion traditionally in the Final Cut world has been, well, you just either bring the project in or you render out a full movie. Mm-hmm. So now you have this share option that's in addition to exporting.
Right.
And when would you use which one?
So a little bit of confusion about that. Some questions I've been seeing about when to use share versus export. Yeah. And here's the way I think about it. I generally now use the share menu anytime I have something from Motion I directly want to get to a device as a final delivery. I want it to the web, I want it for an iPhone, I want it on YouTube, something like that, a final delivery. So I'll go to share because the share menu brings up all of these options. Right. I've got the YouTube version here, but I could choose DVD, iPhone, iPod, whatever, and immediately be done and have that delivered and even upload it to YouTube. Sure. Or burn in a DVD as you've gone over in some other tutorials. So for share, I'll do that. Also, if I want to use one of my own compressor presets, because I have, before this whole thing share came up, I had some compressor presets that did things maybe a little differently than the presets here. So to get to those, I wouldn't do send to compressor here because I don't need to send it to compressor in order to get access to those
to your custom presets.
To my custom presets, right. Instead, I would just go ahead and grab those presets right within this interface right here. I just can't for the life of me remember how to do that, so remind me.
Hey, how about go under that menu?
There we go.
Other, baby.
Thank you. So you go to Other, and the window that comes up shows you all of Apple's built-in presets, as well as all your custom presets. So you still don't need to go all the way to Compressor if you've got a preset set up. If you do want to go to Compressor because you want to tweak a preset, because the only thing you can't do within the share menu is actually change any of those settings. Sure. You have to use the settings that are there that you've created in the past. The other thing I'll do when I'm in the share menu that's specific to Motion is I'll open up this pane here. It's under this Hide Details or Show Details button that will bring this pane up. In the Output section, I'll always double check my output settings. And specific to Motion, I want to make sure that if I'm exporting with an alpha channel that's selected here, if I'm doing 3D and I want lighting, shadows, reflections, depth of field, I can choose to enable them or turn them off and check my render quality. So even if I don't have these things set up correctly within Motion, maybe I'm rendering it draft in order for playback performance, I don't need to change them in the project. I have an opportunity here to go ahead and make changes to how the final render will appear. So for me, in Motion, this is an important part of the share menu is this output section.
I got two questions for you.
All right.
First of all, render quality. I'm having trouble really seeing that much of a difference between normal and best. When would I want to use one versus the other?
You want to use best if you want it to take a really long time.
And I often do.
There you go.
Good.
Yeah. If you're charging by the hour, you go to best.
Yes.
Okay. Otherwise, really the only reason for using best, in my opinion, is when you have vector objects like text or vector objects from Illustrator, vector shapes that get really close to the camera. If you're normal quality, you will see some aliasing on those. If you go to best, they'll be nice and crisp and clear. But that's pretty much it. Most of the rest of the time, best versus normal will be no difference in output. It will just take quite a bit longer to do it.
So my second question is, if you go under the menu here, I have the ProRes, and obviously ProRes with alpha is AKA the 4x4. That's also the default export setting. So is there any difference or advantage of exporting out a ProRes 4x4 from share versus doing file export?
The only advantage that I see and that I do is I'll go under File, Export, I just hit Command E. There's also a keyboard shortcut for the share menu. But when you go to export, it just brings up, by default, it will export with current project and Canvas settings, like you say. Pro is 4x4 with Alpha.
Okay.
So those are identical. In fact, if I want to check all those settings like we looked at in the Share menu,
Sure.
you could click on Options and go to this Output tab, and we've got the same options for lighting and shadows and drop shadow. That's all there.
Right.
So there's really no difference if that's all you want to do. Okay. Normally, I'm just used to using export, so if I just want to export a full quality version, I'll hit Command-D and just use the defaults there.
Right.
But you go through the Share menu. I think it might be one less click
Right.
to do it this way.
Well, and the Share menu also gives you the option you could basically export out a ProRes because you know the client's going to love it, and then send the client one, do a YouTube version for the client or something, so you could do it at the same time.
Share will let you batch.
Exactly.
Share will let you batch, and the export command is a one-off.
Right.
So the only really thing left for export, but that's useful, are really two things. One is when I want to export a still image. Okay, I just have my playhead parked on a frame. I want to export a still image as a sample, like as a keyframe. For a sample for a client, I will go through the export menu and change the export pop-up menu right here to current frame. Okay. And it'll give me just a frame. Or I could choose image sequence. If I'm doing some big complicated render, I might choose an image sequence. In the past, the reason you would do this is because if you chose a QuickTime movie and you crashed somehow in the middle of that process, you would lose the QuickTime movie, and it could be an overnight render. These days, generally, that QuickTime movie is still going to be intact. But I would choose an image sequence to be careful, or I might need an image sequence because I'm delivering it down the road for another compositing application.
Sure. Or you could use Compressor on the other side to then take that image sequence and turn it
into something else, right. So I would go here, I want to do a still image, I want to export a still image for a DVD overlay menu, for instance. I'll do a little overlay in Motion. So that's a good example to export an overlay file. Or what I sometimes like to do is export a selection. Like you might have a complicated background that uses a lot of particles and blurs and stuff like that that's eating up your playback performance. But what you can do with a particular group selected, if you go under File and choose Export Selection, you can export just that selected group. And the cool thing about the export menu here is there's an after export option. So the only other thing that I would use the export command for is to get access to some post-export actions that aren't available within the Share menu. And an example of that is if you have a background element that is using a lot of particles and blurs and it's really impacting performance, you can export just that selection and automatically bring it back in as a rendered movie.
So like a pre-comp.
Like a pre-comp. So I'm going to go into the File menu and choose Export Selection. It'll bring up the same menu as export or the same dialog, but it's only going to export my selected group in this case. And the difference here is under the After Export pop-up menu, I've got an option to either add to media, or what I use is import into project. So it will bake those layers down as one QuickTime movie, and then it'll bring it into the project. I can turn off the original groups and just play that baked version, and I'll get much better performance out of it. So those are really the two reasons I would still use the export menus, to export a still image or to export something I want to bring back into the project. Otherwise, Share does pretty much everything that I want to do now.
One last thing I want to touch on before we close the episode is we get a lot of questions over Ripple Training about should you use the Motion project file in Final Cut, or should you render out a movie and use that in Final Cut? Do you have an opinion?
Well, I'll be the economist and say, it depends. It really depends.
Okay.
If they're small motion projects, I'll use them. Sometimes complex motion projects, when they're in Final Cut and you click on them or you put the playhead above them, you get a spinning beach ball before it renders to take a look at it. I'm actually dealing with that in a project right now, and it can be very annoying. However, the fact that it is a motion project means I can change it very easily instead of rendering out a movie. So it totally depends on your own situation. You just have to know the pluses and minuses and what to do. But most of the time, I will embed the motion project into Final Cut Pro.
And then new to the studio is all these export options, the interplay between the other applications in the suite, the interplay with Compressor specifically via Share, no more exporting to it. So any last thoughts on do you cover things like this in your training?
I do.
Okay.
So I have a full training on Motion 4 that covers the entire app in depth. At rippletraining.com is a place to find out more about that.
Good. And then you also have your website, applemotion.net.
Applemotion.net.
Good. Well, again, thank you for watching MacBreak Studio. I'm your host, Brian Gary, and I've been joined by Mark Spencer.